Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're a history teacher giving a class about the book burnings in Nazi Germany, and you start by talking about how the Nazis first targeted LGBTQ literature by attacking the Institute for Sexual Science, to which one of your students asks, "Did the Nazis only target LGBTQ books?" In that scenario, how would you answer that question? If you're a reasonable teacher, you might say something like, "No, they didn't target only LGBTQ books. While the Institute was the first target of the burnings, the Nazis also went after works written by Jews, of course, as well as the writings of socialists and Marxists, pacifists and anti-war authors, works by modernist artists, as well as other groups that were deemed un-German or undesirable." That's a simple and straightforward answer to the student's question, right? Well, here's something that you wouldn't say if you were a reasonable history teacher.
It's a bit of a like, my understanding is that they burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German. And it was like a retaking of Germany for Germans. That was like the uprising of the Nazis. So it was like, yeah, they were. I think it probably might be both in some circumstances, but like it was categorical for it not being written in German.
This is apolitical streamer and roach whisperer Asmongold, rewriting history to falsely claim that the Nazis didn't burn the research of the Institute for Sexual Science because of queerphobia, but because it was
written in Jewish and not German.
Now, the more astute among you may be aware that Jewish is not a language, it's an ethno-religious identity, unless you're using very antiquated terminology, or translating the word Yiddish from Yiddish itself for some reason. But thankfully we don't need to wonder what Asmongold meant, because in a subsequent video he specified that he actually misspoke.
Which was me misspeaking, I meant Hebrew.
Problem is that that's also wrong. There were some prominent Jewish thinkers and scholars who wrote in Hebrew, however this was mainly in the context of liturgical texts and the Jewish Enlightenment attempting to revive Hebrew. Even the Science of Judaism movement used German to integrate itself into broader European academia. There's little evidence to suggest that Hebrew was used prominently in German scholarly texts, if at all, and there's no credible evidence to suggest that any publications by the Institute for Sexual Science were written in Hebrew. In fact, Magnus Hirschfeld, the founder of the Institute, outright stated that he disliked Hebrew. The only source I found that provided what is at best some very tangential evidence for Asmongold's claim is one paper from 2023 which found about 60 original works and translations of sexology literature published between 1890 and
1937.
Some of which were published in Berlin and other European cities, and which were written in Yiddish, not Hebrew. So the most that can be said is that maybe, just maybe, a handful of copies of Yiddish sexology books and articles might have been available in the Institute for Sexual Science. Now, maybe I'm just an uncharitable woke Marxist or something, but I don't think Asmongold was referencing an obscure paper about Yiddish sexology when he said that the Nazis only burned books because they were written in Jewish.
Objection!
But wait a minute, Asmongold actually has some evidence to back up his claim. Bet you liberals didn't expect that. In his video addressing the criticism he got for his ahistorical lies, Asmongold actually tried to back up his claims and provide additional context for what he said in order to destroy his critics in the marketplace of ideas. Maybe he read an even more obscure paper about Hebrew sexology that I missed. Who knows? So let's watch and see what Asmongold has to say to defend himself. Or rather, let's not. The full clip that I want to address is more than 5 minutes long, and I don't want to make my video unnecessarily long or bore you by playing 5 minutes of Asmongold's content. Still, I'll put the arguments I'm addressing on screen and provide their timestamps so that you can watch Asmongold's full video by yourself and see that I'm not misrepresenting him or taking him out of context. Ultimately, the main point I want to address that Asmongold reiterates throughout the video in a variety of ways is this.
In 1933, in April, Nazi German students decided to organize a nationwide book burning program to eliminate foreign influence, to purify German culture as they saw it.
That's right.
So you have committees of students.
So this is exactly what I said.
Asmon, buddy, hate to break it to you, but your original video is still up. We can see the words that you said, and you did not make the same claim as the person in the video you're watching. Here's the full quote again so everyone can see. It sure is a weird way to communicate that the Nazis targeted more than just queer people by not saying any of those words, and in response to someone who didn't claim otherwise in the first place. In a video entirely dedicated to complaining about queer activists and calling them unhinged, mentally ill, entitled, and groomers, it's very clear to everyone that he was just trying to downplay the queerphobia of the Nazis by falsely claiming that they didn't target the Institute due to publishing positive research and information about the queer community. but because it was written in Jewish. Asmongold is very obviously just trying to retcon what he said in the previous video because he knows that he can't defend it. More terminally online nerds may know this as a Motte-and-bailey fallacy. That's me. I'm the terminally online nerd. So yes, the Nazis were queerphobic. There's a bunch of different sources you can find that will tell you that. The few surviving works from the Institut are written in German, and the Nazis also labeled several non-Jewish authors as un-German. So no, that doesn't mean written in Hebrew. Much like how when conservatives complain about something being un-American, they don't mean that it was written in Spanish. Unless Asmon thinks that conservatives were saying that Colin Kaepernick is Mexican or something. So, Asmongold is very obviously lying. Cool, hope we can all agree on that. But beyond just pointing to the facts and destroying him in the marketplace of ideas, I think it's also worth asking, why is he doing this? Asmongold clearly knows that his previous statement is wrong, which is why he's trying to retcon it. So why not just admit to his mistake and move on? Why insist that you're just a moderate saying common sense things when you consistently agree with and platform right-wing beliefs? There's 1,000 more productive ways to deal with the situation instead of just lying. Well, there's a few possibilities I can think of. One is that his ego is hurt, so he doesn't want to admit that he was wrong, and would instead rather just rewrite his previous statement to sound much broader and more defensible, since no one disagrees that the Nazis targeted more than just queer people. Everyone has at least a bit of an ego, and we're all subject to confirmation bias, so that's possible. There's also the possibility that this is all just part of a grift, or that Asmongold is audience captured. You can make money a lot easier if you grift to the right instead of the left. The audience is easier to please with the same basic and shallow talking points. There's usually less infighting, and if you get big enough, you can even get a paycheck from the Russian government. So besides his ego being hurt, it's also possible that Asmongold refuses to admit that leftists were correct in criticizing him because he knows that grifting to the right pays, or even because he's audience captured. After all, when he eventually apologized for defending the genocide of Palestinians, many people in his audience were angry or disappointed with him, to which Asmongold quickly reassured them that he wouldn't dare to ever actually move to the left, and that he would go back to complaining about the AI right away. In this instance, he may also be trying to avoid alienating his audience, since they clearly didn't like the one time he took accountability and admitted that leftists were right to criticize him. Finally, Asmongold could also be dealing with an internal conflict that I too experienced in the past. At one point in my political journey, I was starting to become more receptive to socialist arguments. Perhaps at that point you could already call me a social democrat or something. I don't remember exactly all the positions I held, but I was already pretty left-leaning. Yet I still insisted on calling myself a centrist. After being fed a bunch of right-wing propaganda and having a pretty distorted view of politics for most of my life, I hesitated to call myself a leftist because I had this idea that the left was filled with emotional woke scolds, and that being a centrist simply meant to consider all the facts in an unbiased manner to come to the correct conclusion, regardless of whether that conclusion leaned left or right. So for all intents and purposes, I could be an anarcho-communist and still call myself a centrist. Of course, that's not what centrism actually means, or how the political spectrum works. But this idea appealed to my younger self. After all, it sounded good to be a moderate, a reasonable centrist who didn't let emotions cloud my judgment, instead just using logic and common sense. This phenomenon, which I like to call moderate bias, is well documented, and hopefully this graph by 538 makes it clear that rarely are so-called moderates actually in the center of the political spectrum. Much like how I didn't want to call myself a leftist, Asmongold may not want to call himself a conservative or right-winger because being a moderate just sounds more appealing. Mind you that this obviously doesn't absolve him of spewing right-wing lies and trying to rewrite queer history, but looking at his statements from this lens of moderate bias can help make sense of his actions. So maybe it's all just a grift, or maybe Asmongold's ego got hurt, or maybe all of these factors played some role in why he chose to lie and double down on his Holocaust revisionism. Who knows, I can't read his mind. But either way, it's really a shame to see this happen soon after it looked like he had seemingly started to improve. As I mentioned earlier, a while back Asmongold got a reality check after defending the genocide against Palestinians. After a ban and a discussion with Hassan, as well as messages from Palestinian fans of his, he apologized and vowed to start improving himself, even making the difficult, excruciating decision of drinking a bit of water. Like I mentioned before, he was quick to assure his fans that he still hated DEI and wasn't moving left. But I and many others still wanted to give him some grace and hope for the best. After all, changing one's political perspective can take time and several small steps, so we still wanted to give Asmongold a chance. Of course, as you can probably tell from this whole debacle, things aren't exactly going well. I'll still hold out hope that Asmongold is willing to improve himself and stop clinging on to reactionary beliefs. But that change has to come from him, because as a great thinker once said,
it's very sad, but one thing that I learned that I keep learning over and over is that when people can't win in the free marketplace of ideas, they have to resort to lies.
And I agree. So if Asmongold chooses to continue lying, all we can do is call him out when he's wrong and address his lies in the hopes that either him or some of his fans will change their minds for the better. Also, Asmongold, debate Hassan, you fucking pussy!